So thank you for joining us for a panel discussion about the unique challenges faced by deaf and hard of hearing community college students. My name is Julie Adams, and I am the Executive Director for the Student Senate for California Community Colleges and the facilitator for this webinar. We are joined today by Alexis Bravo, a Reedley College student, and Edina Rutland, the president of California Association of Postsecondary Education and Disability, or CAPED. Edina is also the director of the Student Accessibility Services at San Jose City College. Nikel, who is on the flyer, is unable to join us today. I will ask each of them to introduce themselves in a moment. But before we begin, I would also like to thank our interpreters, Christian and Sabine, who provide the interpreting services for us today. So we have a series of questions that I will ask to engage both Alexis and Edina in the conversation about the deaf and hard of hearing community. And I'll begin with Edina, who will answer our first question. So Edina, could you please provide a brief summary of the history of deaf education in the United States?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We appreciate you coming to learn more about deaf education and the experience of students that are deaf and hard of hearing, especially at the community college level in California. Deaf education dates back to a very long time ago within the United States. It goes back to the American School for the Deaf being founded in the year 1817 by a man of Laurent Clerc and Thomas Gallaudet. And that was out in the East Coast, again in 1817. And that is the beginning of the development of American Sign Language. It allowed many students to learn sign. And unfortunately, when we move into the early 20th century, American Hearing Society started to have a change in perception in terms of the options that were given to deaf and hard of hearing students. A focus was made on oralism and lip reading in terms of educating deaf people. There was a stringent expectation of the use of hearing aids. Many deaf and hard of hearing students weren't allowed to sign. In fact, they were discouraged and even disciplined for using manual sign language. However, going into the 20th century, into 1975, we have the development of the Education for All Handicapped Children. And this was more emphasizing inclusion. This is where we see the development of individualized education plans, IEPs, and this is where we see the start of mainstreaming of deaf and hard of hearing students. There are still some deaf schools, residential schools at this point in time, and there still have been since then, but there was a huge emphasis and a huge shift in having deaf and hard of hearing students mainstreamed at public schools with hearing children. Moving on into the 1990s, we look at other legislation that was passed, including the Individuals with Disability in Education Act, as well as the Free and Appropriate Public Education, FAPE. And there is a emphasis on having a least restrictive environment for deaf and hard of hearing students. At this point, we see a push in letting parents decide what is best for their children. And because of the push of medical professionals and hearing people, we see that there was a quite a bit of mainstream happening for deaf and hard of hearing children, and that the incidence of deaf people and hard of hearing people attending deaf residential schools with their deaf counterparts was and has been starting to shrink. Many parents of deaf and hard of hearing children decided that they wouldn't want to have their sons and daughters sent away to these residential schools because they are often far away. And so that's why we started to see a shift in so many deaf and hard of hearing students being sent to public education mainstream schools because they were a lot closer. While they were with their peers and they did have access to sign language interpreters, unfortunately, their development was delayed because they weren't with their deaf counterparts. There's also a huge need of having more qualified sign language interpreters and educators, and that's something that we still need. If we're looking at K through 12 as well as college level,
In terms of higher education, we're looking at the ADA Act, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, specifically Section 504 and 508, which emphasizes the access of deaf and hard of hearing people to have the accommodations that they need according to each individual. We all have the right to have the accommodations that we need to have the best access to our education. This is not limited to only providing sign language interpreters. There's an emphasis on providing qualified sign language interpreters, as well as any other accommodations that the individual finds necessary, such as note-taking, assistive technology, certified deaf interpreters for students and for deaf and hard of hearing professors as well. I know I've given you many names and titles of different laws, so I just wanted to make sure that there was an awareness of the history and the laws that are in place that are already supporting the deaf and hard of hearing community. We have the laws in place, but they need to be enforced, which is why we have to be very vigilant and make sure that these laws are being enforced, that we're being allies to the deaf and hard of hearing community to make sure that we can see students succeed in higher education. Alexis has many, many wonderful stories to share about his experience and his advocacy and his collaboration with you all, but he's looking for allyship within everyone because it's very important for the deaf and hard of hearing community.
Thank you, Edina. And now I'd like to ask Alexis to tell us a little bit about share his personal stories or college experience related to navigating everyday college life as a member of the deaf or hard of hearing community.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm so excited to be here today. I was looking forward to this for very, very long, and so I'm very glad to have an opportunity to share my experience as a deaf person. I started attending Reedley College spring semester. And my first experience was at the DSPS service building. And as soon as I walked in, I knew that the services being provided there were given for people with disabilities in general. There isn't really training for any specific disability. So when I walked in, I had this in mind, and it was very clear that deaf people needed. I advocated for the needs that I needed in terms of technology and assistive services, and they started putting a lot of different stipulations on the terms under which I would get my accommodations. I was being told that I needed to arrive early to classes, that I needed to be responsible for the technology. It was a very heavy burden. It wasn't embedded in the system well, and it wasn't comprehensive. It was a lot of work just to have access to my classes. It was not welcoming when I came into the DSPS service. No one said hello to me. It was a very cold environment, and I struggled with this for about 4 months, and I noticed that things weren't getting better. How to work with deaf students and what the needs of deaf people are. Time campus, so I went ahead and decided to be involved in ASG. That was when I was voted as ASG president. That was one of the first things I was involved with first student government, and then I became the Region 5 treasurer. However, my experience as ASG president was very difficult because I wasn't being given interpreters, so I couldn't network with folks, I couldn't connect with faculty. I couldn't connect with my peers. It was always a constant fight to try to get access to student government as well as my education. A lot of people there thought that I couldn't do it, that I couldn't succeed because I was deaf. So I was very, very motivated to prove them wrong. And so that is just a little bit of what I've gone through, and that's what's brought me to where I am today.
And again, I just want to emphasize that uh, building that allyship is paramount to succeeding in terms of having the responsibility to access your education at the college level, having to be responsible for the assistive technology, having to make sure that everything was set up. Alexis, for your laptop, for your video remote interpretation, for all of that to be set up is really sad and unfortunate that that was your experience, because really that's not your responsibility as a student. In order for you to have the success that you need as a college student at the college level, that responsibility shouldn't have been put on you, and it should have been put on the department that was providing those services. And that's something that we definitely need to do in terms of providing better support for our deaf and hard of hearing students, and to be more understanding about the fact that because deaf and hard of hearing people already have these barriers and these obstacles in place, that the onus of responsibility for making sure that all of the assistive technology is in place shouldn't be on them. It should be on the college.
Thank you. So I have another question then. How do cultural factors influence communication and identity within the deaf and hard of hearing community? Can you describe a little bit about the intersectionality of culture?
Yes. Again, I want to emphasize the diversity within the community. No one deaf experience is the same. So I'll be sharing specifically what my experience has been in my intersection of identities, which is that I'm Mexican, I am an immigrant, and I am deaf. And I experience unique forms of oppression in each of these identities, which give me a triple burden of oppression that I experience. When I started becoming involved with the SCCC around 2016, I noticed that there were several caucuses and several groups of allyship and support for a variety of different identities. And I had to introspect and start to figure out which of my identities was most important, which one I had to prioritize. And I had to do a lot of shifting internally in terms of what I prioritized in my personal life and my professional life, who I got to be where. And it became very, very complicated. As an immigrant, I would experience a lot of fear of exploring the world on my own because of different fears of being oppressed or marginalized or ignored, or people saying that I needed to go back to Mexico. Even just sharing with friends and faculty how I felt, I was often ignored and dismissed for my feelings, even though I knew that the fear was real and that a lot of the care that I had to take wasn't unreasonable, but there was a real fear of being deported. I do have color privilege because I am fair skinned, but I am still Mexican. And that is a spectrum within and of itself. Taking care of my safety, making sure that I'm getting what I need, that I'm able to connect with people, that I'm able to fulfill my duties as a student caused a lot of emotional stress and took a lot of my mental bandwidth. It made it really hard for me to be as successful as I wanted to be in education, but I didn't let that stop me. I knew I had to persevere. It was very challenging because it was very taxing on my mental health. I recognized the importance of preserving my mental health, but I also saw the need to be involved in leadership because of these barriers that I was facing every single day. And then amongst all this, I'm still just trying to get my degree. If higher education were a welcoming environment for deaf people, it would be a different story because I would have the support I needed to be successful, but that has not been the case.
Thank you, Alexis. Can you offer insights into the unique challenges faced by deaf and hard of hearing community in accessing resources to ensure your student success? What do you need for your success as a deaf student? You touched a little bit about it earlier, but can you provide us a little bit more information?
So, in terms of my experience and the kind of support that I envision for myself, I've already prefaced with the triple burden of intersectionality that I experience. And I just want to point out that my barriers start from the very small things to where having an interpreter online instead of having one in person, having to remember a charger, and without that, if the power were to go out, I don't have access to my classes, having to request for the interpreter ahead of time, and making sure that everything is set up, that is a very heavy burden and it requires a lot of mental and physical labor. Also, keep in mind that for a lot of deaf people, English is not our first language. For a lot of us, ASL is a first language or another different type of sign language. ASL and English are different grammatically. The sentence structure is different. For example, in English, you say, my name is fill in the blank. In ASL, you don't have functional pieces like is. It's just name and you give your name. In English, you might say, what color do you like? In ASL, the grammar is inverted. it goes opposite from conceptual to question. So you would say color, you like what? So it's different. And there's many parts of ASL that English doesn't have, such as facial grammar and morphemes that are on your face, that is a richness that isn't in English. But because English isn't our first language, we're often perceived as not as educated, and it makes it difficult for our requests to be taken seriously. So I'm explaining all of these little things because these are the things that we have to consider every day when we need to go to a class. We need to make sure that any video our teachers or professors want to give us have closed captions and accurate ones on that. Oftentimes we're given content that isn't captioned, and professors just forget. And they think it's a simple thing, but it's really not. This is something that happens all the time, and it is a barrier to our education. Ideally, in a perfect world, I'd have closed captioning on everything. I'd have access to all the information without having to ask for it ahead of time. In an ideal world, professors would check in with me to make sure that my assistive technologies and my accommodations are in place, that my interpreters are in person, and that they're flexible, because having an interpreter in person is very different than having an interpreter in Zoom. With an interpreter in person, I would be able to have the opportunity to network with my professors and peers before and after class, whereas an interpreter on Zoom wouldn't give me that accommodation. Without an in-person interpreter, I'm often forced to write back and forth with my peers and with my professors, which takes longer, and not everyone is willing to do, and it limits who I get to interact with. A lot of people decide just to avoid me because of that. In an ideal world, I have at least 2 interpreters in each class. Not just an interpreter for some classes, not just 2 interpreters for some of the classes, but in an ideal world, my college would have a full staff of interpreters that could provide and accommodate having at least 2 interpreters in each of my classes.
And coming from the perspective of somebody who is a director of student accessibility services, uh, also providing trainings to staff would be extremely important. That way, faculty, teachers can have an understanding of and an awareness of how they can go about interacting and communicating with a deaf person. Because oftentimes these professionals may have never interacted with a deaf person before. So I think also to add on to what you said, adding training and sensitivity awareness and cultural trainings is tantamount to the success of college students that are deaf and hard of hearing. At San Jose City College, this is something that we have tried to implement. This is something that we have had the ability to have the faculty be a part of these trainings and have an ability to understand about deaf culture and to understand about the everyday lives of deaf people and how they can make it a little bit easier on us when we enter the educational system. That training, that knowledge is really important. And it will allow for deaf and hard of hearing people to have a more rich and beautiful experience at the college level. It'll allow for people to feel included. It will allow people to feel connected, whether they're a student or whether they're a faculty member.
Thank you. And we have a question in the Q&A that I think fits within here. So I'm going to go ahead and take a little liberty and ask the question. So it's from Travis, and I have my first deaf student in a class this semester. She has been regularly complaining about the quality of the interpreters our school has available. We have had 7 different interpreters at this point. What can I do as an educator to help her when the interpreters aren't effectively working for my deaf students? And I know Alexis and I've had a conversation about this. So share with us, Alexis, your perspective and how this faculty member can help in this situation. And maybe provide a little background about why the student is saying that maybe these interpreters are not, do not seem to be qualified.
Yes, I'm happy to share. I'll be sharing a few different things. When we're in the classroom and there are interpreters and there's an appropriate setup, there should be at least 2, and you'll notice that they switch constantly during the class time. Ideally, these interpreters are aware with the content being presented in class. There's a variety of different linguistic backgrounds that deaf people come from. Some people were late deafened, some people didn't have exposure to sign language, some people grew up signing. There's a variety of different experiences. And qualified interpreters, of course, are skilled to accommodate that individual's needs. However, HR and hiring committees usually aren't aware of these different nuances of linguistic needs and linguistic skills of professionals to fit the needs of the student. So these things are not often considered when interpreters are being hired. Sometimes interpreters are hired on a contract basis instead of being hired for the whole class period or for the whole semester, for the whole session of class time. And so interpreters are being switched in and out, and it's not the same consistent interpreters, which causes confusion, again, because of the nuance of linguistic preferences and needs for the student, because each interpreter might not know what happened prior. They don't have the context of the class. They don't have the context of the client's linguistic preferences. So these are some reasons why there might be complaints of interpreters not being qualified. Also, there is a notorious problem within the interpreting community of interpreters not pausing and asking for clarification when it's necessary, but letting misinterpretations and miscues pass until the end of class. And that affects the student experience. It's also important to consider cultural experiences because it does impact language and communication styles. Supposing you have a student who's a person of color and there is a Caucasian male interpreter that's brought into class that the student might not be able to identify with. Their language skills might be different. The cultural nuances might not be understood by the interpreter, which impacts the way that the communication is facilitated. There's a lot of awkwardness and it's not efficient. It can cause, for the most part, a lot of miscues that impact the way the student is perceived, which causes further oppression. At this point, I recommend educators and faculty members to check in with students to see which of these factors is impacting them, to see whether it's having an interpreter that matches their cultural identity and linguistic skills, whether it's bringing in more interpreters for that class, whether it's bringing in an interpreter plus having a transcription service alongside, so that if there are specific words that are missed by the interpreter, I can see them on the screen. Having a note taker might also be something you should look into to support your deaf students, because a note taker might catch things that the interpreter missed. And also, deaf people have a lot of things taxing their visual attention. Therefore, having a note taker allows for the student to pay attention to the interpreter and the presentation and then have notes for after the class.
See that Edina wants to add.
And also think about connecting with your disability support programs and services department. Right now, there is not enough interpreters and not enough skilled, qualified interpreters. Unfortunately, that is the situation that we are currently facing within the deaf and hard of hearing community. That could possibly be the case. It could also be an instance of the evaluations of these interpreters not being fulfilled appropriately. That is something that I have witnessed in some institutions where there isn't a clear evaluation guideline for interpreters that are brought into that institution. So there are a variety of factors that may be impacting it. I definitely think getting to know your student accessibility services center, going to their office and trying to see what kind of resolutions can be brought to place for this student. Definitely going to your DSPS center is something that would be the next best step to try to figure out the problem that could be resolved with this student's barriers.
Thank you. Thank you for that, and thank you for the question, Travis. So I'm going to move to our next area, and that's in communication. So what are some common misconceptions or stereotypes about deafness, and how can we work to debunk them?
I have two that I'd like to share that I think are the most common misconceptions. I think it is that interpreters are always qualified and are always speaking in the correct register that fits the deaf person and what they're signing. For instance, while I was ASG president, I had a couple of interpreters, a couple of interpreting experiences that were not fitting for the communication that I was giving. It was a very high register environment, and I know what the terms are in a high register environment, but my interpreter didn't. And that affected the way I was perceived. And in the same vein, I noticed that in terms of a lot of the procedures that were happening, there wasn't an understanding for the processing time that was needed during the interpretation. So a lot of questions that I had, a lot of comments that I wanted to give were not mentioned because people were not considering the lag time necessary for the interpreters. Going back to the example of how an interpreter's vocabulary and context and prior knowledge impacted me and how I was perceived. One time I had an interpreter that wasn't familiar with parliamentary procedures, and we were doing roll call, and I know that the appropriate term is to say I am present, or same for I am present and I am here. However, my interpreter chose to say I am here, and it made me look very poorly around my peers and colleagues in a very high register environment. And I wasn't sure if people were going to vote for me because they were still hung up on the words that my interpreter chose for me. It's very important for interpreters to look at assignments before they take them and take an honest look at their skills and their skills in other fields to see if they have the capacity and the prior knowledge to adequately interpret that situation and to not take the assignment if it's not appropriate for them. Of course, if there ever isn't an interpreter, you can always write back and forth. When you're writing back and forth with a deaf person, again, remember that English for most of us is not our first language. So sometimes when I take pieces of paper, I don't understand them right away, and I ask for clarification, I ask for the meaning, because ASL is very different and is very rich in different ways that English is not. However, that sometimes impacts the way I'm perceived because of my English proficiency. Sometimes a couple seconds of signing is equivalent to an entire paragraph of English writing because of how much meaning is embedded in the movement, in our facial expression, in the grammar we use, in our mouth morphemes. And this is very important to keep in mind when you see or might be communicating with a deaf person writing in English, and there needs to be clarification and questions. It's not a reflection of their intellect, but our languages are very different. If someone is very proficient in ASL and they're a beautiful signer, and that's perceived as a sign of intelligence in the deaf community, as it should be, then it shouldn't affect how we're perceived because of our English proficiency. English proficiency is not a marker of intelligence. If written English is not working when you're trying to communicate with a deaf person, there is an interpreter, you don't know sign, don't be afraid to rely on images, on pictures, on gesture to communicate. There's a lot of different tools that you can use to communicate with a deaf person. Again, it depends on each individual what their communication preferences are. Some people prefer to have hearing interpreters. Some people prefer to have a team of hearing interpreters and a CDI, a certified deaf interpreter, who are trained specifically in making sure that language is being produced in a very visual manner that is accommodating for culture as well as language. Sometimes hearing interpreters aren't able to give that important visual adjustment. And that leads to misunderstanding because there needs to be more in the interpretation to make sure that it's an equitable form of communication for the deaf people receiving it. That's the special skill set of CDI is being able to use facial expression and gesture and role playing and a variety of different linguistic tools that fill in the gaps, especially with deaf folks that have experienced language deprivation or have minimal language skills because of other factors.
And in my perspective, one of the big misconceptions is that hearing people think that all deaf people are phenomenal lip readers, and that is just not true. Lip reading is extremely challenging. It doesn't come easy to any of us that happen to know how to lip read. And even when we do, we're only able to catch so much. But that is often something that deaf people and hard of hearing people face, that hearing people will come up to them and they'll ask them, "Oh, can you lip read?" And they have this expectation that they'll be able to understand everything that they're mouthing by understanding their lip reading. And that's just not true. It is extremely taxing. It's extremely challenging. Um, if you, as a hearing person, had to think about plugging your ears and trying to lip read everybody around you, I promise you, you would not be able to lip read. It is extremely difficult. It's a very special skill set, and being able to understand the English language is one thing, but as a deaf person, being able to understand English and then understand it on the lips is just something in and of itself is something very entirely different. So that is a huge misconception that deaf and hard of hearing people face, is that we all can lip read.
Thank you. And both of you answered the next question. So we are doing really well on time. So can you describe, Alexis, can you discuss the significance of representation and visibility for deaf and hard of hearing individuals within your campus community and in the broader educational context?
Yes, absolutely. We need more deaf leaders. For a while, at least in my own environment, I've been the only one. There's so many people that are involved in higher education, and it can feel very isolating at times. So we definitely need more. Oftentimes, when the complaints and struggles of deaf and hard of hearing individuals in higher education are presented to people in power, we're dismissed. There's no demonstration of any urgency or need to respond systematically to fix these issues. There's an assumption that most deaf people are the same, that our needs and experiences are the same, but they're not. Everyone has a different journey, everyone has different needs and accommodations in order to succeed. Part of the problem is that most people don't know anything about deaf people or the deaf experience or the kinds of accommodations that we might need. So there is no expert or anyone in higher education that is feeding this important information to the people in power who can do something. And because so many deaf people face barriers in higher education and don't succeed, there are very few people who have all the information and know the needs that need to be met and how to fix the problems. A lot of deaf leaders are afraid of being involved because higher education is often not welcoming to us. A lot of them aren't aware of their 9+1 rights or the Brown Act or parliamentary procedure. Appealing, making objections. There's a lot of fear of getting involved because of this lack of information that we have because of the barriers that are in place. Constantly asking for these accommodations and for our needs to be met is exhausting. So unfortunately, a lot of deaf and hard of hearing folks drop out. Sometimes there are some environments that will seem to be welcoming at first, but assume that we have everything we need to succeed already. And there's no follow-up, there's no support. When really there's a lot of catching up that needs to be done because of the struggles that we face every day. I remember when I was ASG president, a lot of people were very impressed and excited to have a deaf president at our ASG for the very first time. However, I wasn't met with a lot of support. A lot of my teachers didn't believe that I was ASG president when I told them. A lot of my deaf peers weren't aware of the position I had taken. They weren't even aware that they could have run for it as well. It's very important for deaf and hard of hearing individuals to be represented in leadership roles, to be represented in higher education, because there's so much focus on the hearing loss of that lack that we're not seen, and then other deaf people don't want to participate, don't want to be involved because they don't see themselves reflected in the leadership. And because there's no representation, there's no knowledge of the accommodations we need, people freak out when you see a deaf leader. How do I find an interpreter? What do you need? What can I do? I have no idea how to support you. If there were more representation of deaf and hard of hearing individuals in leadership and in higher education, systemically, we would be able to provide the right accommodations for everyone and make sure that everyone has equitable access to higher education. It's so important to see us as equals because we are the same. The only difference is that we can't hear. That's it. There's so many forms of diversity and humanity. We speak different languages, we have different cultures, there's so many different ethnic groups and peoples that are honored for their differences and for the diversity that they bring to humanity. And deaf people are just another piece of that diversity. We're given such a hard time, so many barriers to success, and it's a real challenge that it shouldn't be. We should be seen as equals. It takes a lot of tenacity to be where I am today, but it shouldn't. It shouldn't. We should all have the equal opportunity, be seen as equals, to be involved in whatever endeavors we desire.
Thank you, Alexis. So that leads us to our next question. Since there are not a lot of representation, how can we as allies and advocates support the needs and rights of the deaf community and deaf and hard of hearing community?
The top thing I can say is to always ask the individual what they need, how they prefer to communicate. Personally, for me, I never want to be asked to lip read. I don't mind writing or having an interpreter. Those are my preferences. A different deaf person might want to have a CDI, might want to have writing back and forth. Don't make an assumption on what anybody needs. Always ask the individual. you're ever in a group together and a deaf or hard of hearing person joins y'all, that's great. Include them, be involved. But remember that your conversation needs to be made accessible. Everyone's crosstalk needs to be made accessible. Everyone is getting to be a part of a very rich conversation. And if all the deaf person gets is a couple of words written down on a piece of paper, that's not equitable. That's not inclusive. To just give a quick synopsis of what was said amongst a group of folks isn't equitable. It's very important to share all the details, to find ways to have the deaf person involved, because there's so much that's said and we want to be a part of it all. It causes a great disconnect when we're given short synopsises here and there. We don't get to participate. It's going to give a complete and full description and explanation of what's being said. Something that you can do for this is to have some kind of live transcription app on your phone and making the conversation visual. Also, something that cannot be forgotten is to please have patience with us, have patience with interpreters. We're used to communicating quickly back and forth. But if there's a lot of crosstalk, then we're going to miss things. The interpreter isn't going to have time to relay the message faithfully. If there are no pauses, there won't be enough time for the deaf person to get the message from the interpreter and then ask a question if the interpreter is still producing the original message. So please be patient, please slow down, please allow processing time for the interpreter, or if someone is writing back and forth. Making these pauses, minimizing cross talk, having patience, all show us that you care about us and are actually trying to make an inclusive environment. Because otherwise, all of the hearing folks in the space are going to have full access to all of the information. They're going to have full access to all the opportunities, and the deaf and hard of hearing people present are going to have a fraction of that. There's information that is going to be missing. There's going to be less participation from the deaf and hard of hearing person or people present because they weren't given that time. And it creates inequality.
Go ahead, Edina.
And again, if your college is providing any sort of event, whether that's in the classroom, whether that's like a campus event, please have inclusivity at the forefront of that event. Make sure you can try to provide some sort of captioning system in place or having interpreters accessible and available. Because when a hearing person goes to an event or enters a classroom, they don't have to think about the accommodations that need to be made. They just show up and accessibility is already there for them. It's built in to the event to have the event accessible to hearing people, whereas with deaf people, it's the other way around. We have to ask for accommodations. We have to make sure that we have our needs met for accessibility. And I know that sometimes hearing people are sometimes hesitant as to how to approach a deaf person. And I know Alexis has had a great deal of that, but please approach us. Please come to us and have conversation. We don't want to be isolated. We don't want to not communicate with you, because by doing that, we're put into this silo where we're only able to communicate and socialize with deaf people, whereas we want to be able to socialize with everybody at an event or in the room. That's really important for us as deaf people to feel like we can be a part of the event and be included. So please, like, if you ever want to approach a deaf person, do so. Don't be scared. Just go ahead and approach them. We're open. We're going to talk to you. We will.
And to that point, Edina, that you mentioned that burden of having to ask for interpreters beforehand, we might not be aware of the event that you're planning. We don't have that on our radar for every single organization in existence that's trying to put on an event. So if you really care about being inclusive and making sure that there's equal opportunity at your event, have interpreters, whether or not you have a deaf attendee that sign up yet or not, because then that would mean that if I just see your ad on the day of, I can show up and have access.
Mhm.
For a lot of deaf and hard of hearing folks, we see an ad for an event and we assume we can't go because we didn't request an interpreter 2 weeks ago and we didn't even know about the event. And that creates erasure of deaf and hard of hearing people because then they're not showing up because there's no access historically. If you do have an interpreter, make sure they're in a visible place. Make sure they're easy to see. Make sure that it's known that you're going to have an interpreter there so that if a deaf person sees your flyer, they know that they're going to have access and they can go and they can find the interpreter easily.
Thank you. And Guadalupe, I see you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Oh, do you mind spotlighting them? Okay.
I did.
Excuse me. I think there was a miscommunication with the interpreters. Do you mind repeating your question so it can be interpreted? The students have a different level of English skills. And there are different types of disabilities that impact language proficiency, such as autism and a variety of different things. So how would that be approached? Okay, so now, oh, this is Alexis. I will be answering the question. Everyone has their own upbringing in the same way that no deaf person is the same. Everyone has different factors that are impacting their life and their language skills. I have a friend that it has ADHD and autism. They are also a wheelchair user and they have only one of their arms. So that is how they sign. DSPS has to coordinate with their teachers to make sure that everyone's on the same page because their communication needs are very specific. This is the job of DSPS to know the specific needs of every single student, have them documented and relay them to the teachers and anyone else that is in their service team. That is their responsibility. It should not be on the shoulders of the students to bear this burden. Of course, we need more training for this, as much training as possible to make sure that each student has their accommodations met and that it's the responsibility of DSPS. Of course, this is not a change that's going to happen overnight. We don't expect this, but there needs to be a less incidence of these types of issues. And personally, I'd like to tell you, if you're needing to request accommodations, don't be shy about it. You have a right to your accommodations, ask for them. If you don't say anything, they won't know. So, and they're not trained to inquire. So it's very, very important to go and advocate for yourself. If you need an ally to go with you, just to be present, do that. But self-advocacy is critical. Does that answer your question? This is Guadalupe. Yes, that answers my question. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I think we're at time. I think there's one more question, but I'm not sure we have time to answer that. And I think that you have answered it in there, and it's about DSPS and how can a person who is a DSPS worker help and improve the deaf experience in their department and on campus. And I think you express that in what you're saying is ask the student the services they need, track the student, and make sure that the faculty who are in the classrooms have the information, as well as what Edina said earlier, ensuring that faculty are trained on how to serve deaf and hard of hearing students on the campus. So with that, I think we're at time, unless Alexis or Dina, you have one more or anything else to add before we close?
Adina, would you like to answer?
Just want to say thank you all for joining and taking the time out of your busy lives to be here and to learn more about the deaf and hard of hearing community, learning about how to communicate with us, how to communicate with deaf and hard of hearing students. If you happen to have students that are deaf and hard of hearing, please advocate to the school to provide trainings. Work with your local DSPS office to try to make the accessibility easier on the deaf and hard of hearing students, and have less of the responsibility being placed on the students and having it the responsibility put onto the department and having it put onto the school. There are a lot of students who may not necessarily even know about their local DSPS services that are available to them. And I just want to go ahead and thank everybody for being here. Thank you to Alexis. He's a wonderful presenter. He's a wonderful student. He's a wonderful representative in leadership as a deaf person. So I really want to take a shout out to Alexis and thank you for all that you do.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity to share my experience, as difficult and raw as it's been. But I'm very, very happy and honored to be in all the roles that I get to fulfill. Just a few weeks ago, I was voted in as Vice President of Communications for the SCCC, and I am so, so grateful and excited and proud and honored to be in this position. So thank you all so, so very much. And I really appreciate every single person who came and gave their time to listen to us and support us. And I wish you luck in each and every one of your journeys and every single goal that you might have. And so thank you again for coming and keep being an ally. Keep advocating.
So,
And of course, I need to thank Edina for coming and sharing her wisdom, and Julie for putting this all together. So thank you so, so much.
and I want to thank everybody for coming as well. And thanks to Alexis for being a real leader and champion for the deaf and hard of hearing community. We're excited to bring him on board for the SSCCC as the Vice President of Communication, and look for us doing more in this arena for our deaf and hard of hearing students. And Edina, thank you for your participation and for your advocacy and your partnership with the SSCCC. We appreciate you being involved in the webinar, as well as like I said, being a partner. And of course, to Chris and Sabine, thank you so much for being here and for interpreting for sharing their voices so that we all could understand. And again, I'd say thank you to everybody and have a good evening.
Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.